Hi, I'm Violet Brackman,
Sam Power.
I'm Lawson Dunford.
And I'm Luke Mazer.
and welcome back to a very spooky special episode of Manon Dejour. This week, we're going to be discussing The Thing, a body horror movie directed by John Carpenter in 1982 that follows a group of American research scientists who are attacked by an extraterrestrial shape-shifting monster in the deep Arctic. We will be discussing if the movie takes a realistic, formalistic, or naturalistic approach to film. Sam, do you want to go first on your opinion of it?
Sure. I enjoyed the movie. I thought it was going to be a lot scarier than it was. It wasn't too scary, other than some of the body horror. Um, Overall, I thought on the continuum of the scale that we're supposed to rate it on, I would say it was more of a realistic classical Hollywood film with hints of naturalism in it. It seemed like it was just scaled more toward that kind of genre. And yeah, that was pretty much the overall gist of what I thought it was. So.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed the movie. I thought a lot of the cinematography of it was really cool, and overall this was kind of a very interesting horror movie that doesn't necessarily it's very Hollywood, and I would definitely say that overall it has it's very realism, but I would definitely say that there's something that draws me in about this movie that I like a lot, that's very formalistic, which is why I kind of into it so much, because it's a very interesting take on a Hollywood horror movie.
So I had similar views to Sam. I thought that the overall movie was realism for the most part, with hints of naturalism sprinkled in as well. And just because realism it mimics reality, but it doesn't necessarily look like reality. Um, the reason why I thought this was realism was because everything looked checked out for reality. It was in a research facility in Antarctica, and they're all scientists. But then there's the added fact of the alien, which wasn't really that realistic. So,
yeah. I really enjoyed the movie. I thought it was interesting that it wasn't your typical scary movie, and it didn't involve any jump scares or anything like that. Overall, I agree. I thought it was mainly realistic in a classical Hollywood film, but I thought there were traces of both naturalism and formalism depending on the scene that you were watching. So.
Should we start with talking about camera and talk about pieces of evidence where we saw these different forms take place? So one of the scenes where I really felt like it's a good example of how this is a classic Hollywood take on horror movie and really showed a lot of realism is the scene where they're all at the table when they are talking about going to see where the Norwegians came from, to their base, and all of them are on one side of the table, and the camera is looking at all of them, and this is something that we've talked about before about how this is a very classical Hollywood approach. In real life, not everyone would be on the bisect of the screen, movements, and also the shots are very Hollywood. But then at the same time, there were some times where the camera angles didn't feel as kind of fake, and you did feel more like you were in the movie, which was when they go to the the Norwegians' base and you're kind of like looking at the window and watching them like walk in, it almost feels like you are there and you're kind of like seeing them, which feels like a little bit more like you're in the movie, which I feel like would give a much different approach from like Hollywood.
So I had first was which really stood out to me was two different things. One was the explosions at the end of the film. They were like they were realistic in the sense that that's what you'd expect an explosion to sound like, but like it was that classic Hollywood like fill in for the explosion, and you could kind of tell that it wasn't actually like the whole entire base was exploding with dynamite, but it had like a different sound to it. And also like I also had um for realism was the sound of the alien screeching. It was just like very interesting. So
Yeah, kind of going off what Violet said earlier about the camera angle. I specifically remember that camera angle shot where they're visiting the Norwegian base, and you look in the camera's kind of looking through the window, and there's a lot of camera angle shots like that where like throughout the film where it's kind of like an ominous kind of like camera angle where it's you're not really sure like what's gonna happen. I thought there would be some more jump scares in the beginning with just based on like camera angles, um, but it turned out it was just like trying to make it feel like more of a classical, realistic Hollywood film. So that was kind of my take on the camera angles.
Yeah, there were actually like a few of those shots, like looking through windows. Like I remember one where they're waiting for McReady and Childs to come back from McReady's little hut off to the side after they found out that the lights were still on, and that kind of made you feel like it was like a first-person shot looking through the window, and that made it seem like for me it made reminded me that like I was watching the movie, like it didn't really seem that real in the sense that like obviously honestly I don't know. I just for me it didn't seem very real.
Another camera shot that I thought was really interesting that reminded me of The Shining is when the dog goes into the room, and you're at like the eye level of the dog and you're kind of like following the dog backwards, as well as in the scene before that. In a lot of scenes there's often a lot of shaky cam. Like when we start the movie we already are introduced to like the shaky cam of when you're like looking at the mountains, and I feel like that definitely gives it a rich project. So as we've talked about, kind of this like shaky cam movement, so I thought that was also kind of a little bit going against the realism, because as we know classical Hollywood is uh more often than not very like steady camera movements. So should we move on and talk about editing?
Sounds good.
So one of the editing things that I think is really clear in this movie is there's a lot of cut to blacks or fade to blacks, and I think that cut to blacks are very much so more of a Hollywood technique. I would say that this is more realism, because it is something that's, I definitely wouldn't say it's naturalist. It's like naturalism, because in real life, suspense to things like you don't all of a sudden cut to black. So I think it's a very Hollywood approach to like create suspense and kind of like make you feel like you're like not really sure what happened just then. So I think that like all the cuts to black that happened in the movie are way more indicative of like realism, and the fact that they kind of like make you wonder what's going on without actually like showing you things by using editing techniques that obviously like aren't like what reality is really like.
There wasn't there wasn't a ton of action. It wasn't like an action-packed film, but in the parts where there was action, where especially in the like when the monster was like emerging from like the imitation of like the human or the dog, there was some jump cuts um, in the film that through the editing. Would you say that's like catered toward more of a realistic classic Hollywood approach?
I would say that like jump cuts are, from what I understand, more formalistic and a little bit more experimental and avant-garde.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure where that would fit in on the continuum, but I do remember like when the a monster was like attacking the other dogs, there was some good jump cuts there, and like cuts on action and stuff like that. So that definitely
Yeah.
made it feel like I wasn't sure if it was like because it felt like kind of a classic Hollywood film, but you could definitely notice the jump cuts.
Acting, I thought there was actually a lot of self-reflexivity with the dogs, because it's like animals are kind of like this thing where it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen, there's this documentary called Don't Fuck with Cats, and it's horrific, and it was about this guy who posted videos online of him murdering cats, and they're like really gruesome videos, like really horrible. And it started like this huge thing, like thousands of people on Facebook were trying to like hunt down this guy and figure out who he was, because so many people were so upset that he was like killing these kittens. And I feel like it's a little bit self-reflective that like animals are like the one thing that can like do no wrong in the world, and the fact that like the dog is usually the one who like comes in, saves the day, like Scooby-Doo finds the bad guy, like saves the human, is like the, and so I feel like the fact that the dog is like the monster and the evil is kind of self-reflective on like humanity, because we feel like the dog can do no wrong, but then you also like know that the dog is sketchy, like this dog comes, the people are trying to shoot him, you're like something's off with this dog. But I think it's like the self-reflexivity of like you always want the dog to be good, like I'm like, oh my god, such a cute fluffy dog, I just want to pet it, but I like know it's evil, but I don't want it to be evil in the end and like be bad. And it's also like the fact if it was a human who like pretended that they needed shelter and was like, these people are hunting me down, they're crazy, like please save me, and then ended up killing everyone or leading to them all being dead, I would be angry at them. But like because it was a dog, I was like, that poor dog, like morphing into an like evil creature. And so I thought that that was very like self-reflexive, and the fact that like this dog is kind of like what is evil and like brings the evil to them.
Going back to what Sam was talking about those jump cuts, towards the very beginning, one thing that I thought was more along the lines of formalism was when they were chasing after the dog in the helicopter, and it kept jumping between like the guy shooting and then to the dog running away, and then to the guy shooting and then to the dog running away. And so that seemed like pretty experimental to me, and that was one of the like formalistic, like one of the few formalistic areas I kind of saw in the film. So
Yeah, those also definitely didn't make sense, because sometimes I was like, the dog was running towards something, and then the next shot you get, you're like kind of disoriented because you're like, how is the dog still running? I thought it was like running towards these mountains, but it's not. And I feel like they definitely broke either like the 180 rule or something, because it was definitely like disorienting where the dog was and where the dog was going and like where the helicopter was by those edits. Should we move on to sound if we have nothing else on editing? So one of the things that I thought was really like a realistic approach and a classical Hollywood approach with the sound is the fact that they're in the middle of the Arctic and they are just like having normal conversations when there are clearly very intense winds blowing, and you would probably have to shout really loudly to talk to people. Like, I highly doubt if we were in the middle of the Arctic, we could just be like standing here having a normal conversation like they do sometimes. And so I think that's like very classical Hollywood. The fact that she's saying perfectly clear, even though it's like if you were in the middle of the Arctic where it's like basically a blizzard out right now, and like you can still hear them and they can hear each other, it seems like very classical Hollywood.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even think about the sound like outside. It made me just feel like immersed in the film, because I was just kind of focused on like who was gonna be like taken by the monster next. Um, and then the sound with the to build off of that, the sound like there's just the soundtrack in general with the ominous like kind of eerie music. Definitely felt it was probably more like a horror film. I don't know if you could say it was something to do with formalism because it was more noticeable, I felt like sometimes, and it was kind of uncomfortable. But I'm not sure if I don't know where that fits in between formalism and realism. But you could definitely notice like the sound. It was almost not like music, but just like eerie sounds in the background. But it was definitely like the soundtrack.
One thing that I noticed was, which was very classic Hollywood, and it's seen a lot in horror films, is I feel like once we realized that there's something that was off with things and our senses were heightened, all the sounds seemed to be like exaggerated. Like every time a door would open, it'd be the only thing you'd hear, and it'd be really loud, like almost as if it was like uh, keeping you on your toes, for a larger sound, like a jump scare. Like throughout the film, there's many times that I was like, oh, okay, this is probably gonna be a jump scare, and it turned out it wasn't. And I think it was because like of these super pronounced sounds, and it brought me back to reality, in the sense that I was like, okay, like it's these sounds aren't going to be as pronounced in real life. Like it's just trying to get us to heighten our senses and suspense in the movie.
Yeah, one of the areas I noticed that like really exaggerated sound into the film is when they were testing the blood. Like you're so like anxious to see who's gonna have monster blood that every time they put the like hot metal, I think it was, into the blood, and you just hear that loud hiss, and you're like, okay, well it's not them. And the like exaggerated sound was like, it just made you feel like almost surprised and like scared at the same time. I don't know.
Yeah, also the scene where what's the cook's name? Something with an N. I
There
don't
was
remember.
many characters. I can't remember them all.
I know. When he's like cooking in the kitchen, and what's his face comes in and is like, I just got shot. And he's like playing that like pop music on the radio. I forgot what song it is.
Oh,
But
it was
that's
like
also very,
the Stevie Wonder song.
yeah, like that's like very classical Hollywood to have
Mhm.
like pop music playing in the movie.
Definitely.
So I thought like the mise en scène of the movie was something that was like really big for why I thought it was more formalistic, I think. One of the biggest things for me was what they wear, because I felt like what they wear is kind of a little bit of self-reflexivity. I think it's really funny that these are like government scientists and they're wearing like what looks like old ski gear. Like they're in the middle of the Arctic and they're like not wearing, I feel like they would have like, when I think of like scientists working in the Arctic for America, I feel like they would have like all white snowsuits that are probably like up to government regulation. They have like patches, whereas these just seem like they were like some guys were going on like a ski trip. Like half of them had like, some of them had ski goggles on, and then some of them had like these weird other like kind of cyberpunk glasses. And it kind of seemed like they were like, uh-oh, we don't have enough ski goggles for everyone. We can use like these. Which that kind of made me feel like it was more formalistic and a little bit more avant-garde. The fact that it also is like, you feel like they're like nerds. You don't think they're gonna be like dressed super nicely. So they're dressed like, I feel like nerdy guys without a lot of style would be dressing, even though they're probably like working for a government who I feel like would have government like regulated clothing. And so I felt like there's a little bit of self-reflexivity there, just like how they're dressed and how you feel like they would be dressed.
One thing from Mise en Scène that I noticed was, well, I actually kind of like brought me back to reality as well and made me realize I'm watching a film, was the mise en scène of the Norwegians base. It was very like, I was very surprised to see how it looked. Like I had imagined that it was gonna look similar to the base that the Americans had, but it looked like it had been abandoned for weeks. Like especially when I found the body, that was just like, he was just like dead. Like I don't know. I thought it was kind of like corny a little bit, and it also brought me back down to reality. So yeah, it was very surprising to me. It didn't make sense. Like I imagined like they had just flown the helicopter the other day chasing the dog. Like I didn't understand why the entire base looked like it was uninhabited for like months, you know, with like holes everywhere and like just like dead people like randomly sitting in chairs. It was very interesting.
Also, the fact that it was like so cold in there that the dead blood was like frozen, dripping off of him, and like his sliced open neck, he like froze like that. Yet they didn't even seem to be like cold or like bothered by it. The whole concept, I definitely think that like as the movie progresses, like they seem to get a little, they're like more frosty looking, but they're definitely not as cold as I feel like they should be. Like sometimes they're not wearing hats and stuff, and I'm like, this guy's blood froze midair, and you're like not cold, which like doesn't really make sense to me. But I also think the mise en scène of like where they live is really funny because it kind of looks like a dive bar or something. Like they have like a pool table and like kind of like neon looking-ish lights, and it like feels very like American, like sit down, have a burger, which also seems funny to me. And the fact that like Americans go to like the Arctic to like research, and they're like, they create like a full American vibe inside like their Arctic base.
It definitely had a speaking towards that American feel. It definitely had a like a 70s, 80s kind of feel with some of those, like the rec room was some of the colors in there and like the pool table. It just the furniture definitely felt right for the time period that the movie came out.
I thought it was funny, another piece of mise en scène, when he was playing chess in the beginning and he lost. And I don't know, I just wouldn't have expected like this big arcade looking like retro chess machine to be in the Arctic with them. And then to have him just like pour coffee down it, I was so insulted. I was like, oh, that was a perfectly good chess game. You ruined it.
Yeah, it's also I feel like if you're stuck in the Arctic with not a lot to do, you wouldn't break your computer. Like, that seems kinda, like, stupid to me. I think another big thing that, is important to this movie is their use of, practical effects instead of, like, SFX and, like, um, visual effects done online. I think that avant-garde movies, are more likely to use practical effects. Like, when I think of something that's, like, a lot like this is Eraserhead by David Lynch, the alien baby is a lot like this monster, and that's, like, a very, very avant-garde movie, and, I feel like that is, that type of, like, monster is a lot more formal like naturalism would be or realism would be. Like naturalism, I feel like you often see like a lot more like visually done CGI stuff when we think about like movies nowadays. Whereas this like kind of like the fact that it's like actually there, like they made these prosthetic like fake monsters makes it feel a lot more formalistic.
Yeah, the monsters definitely felt like they just didn't they were sometimes they're almost goofy with the faces. They left like the human faces on there, but they'd have like spider legs coming out of them, and it definitely felt like it just sometimes I was like, this is like kind of a goofy like horror movie, but it was kind of gross at the same time to watch the monster like emerge from the people. And I can definitely see how that was, for me, that was probably the most formalistic part of the movie. And like the rest of the movie, I would say was more realistic, the realism, classical Hollywood, but that experimental kind of not using CGI definitely called out like this formalistic approach of the filmmaking, I guess. So
I just thought it was really interesting that like the movie was so poorly received when it came out because of this like formalistic horror style and like all this bloody, gory, like violent scenes. But now, like after like reevaluating the movie, it's like praised as like a really super great horror film. So I just thought that it was interesting that the formalistic style like had that effect.
do we have
I
anything
also
else on mise en scène?
I was just gonna say that this isn't really mise en scène, but I just think like the whole concept of it in total kind of feels a little bit more formalistic. Like the fact of like the fear of like not knowing who's evil and who's good, and kind of the fact that like they end up like sabotaging themselves by like obviously it's like totally fair for them to like mistrust people when like this evil being can be anyone. Um, but I think it's kind of interesting this like whole thing of like mistrust and like how they kind of essentially like kill each other is like a much like leads to a much more like avant-garde discussion film might.
Yeah, going off of what you said, it's not really mise en scène, but like I thought it was interesting how like the beast could imitate or whatever the thing could imitate its host perfectly, and then as soon as someone called out the thing, like all hell broke loose. Like when they were testing the blood, like the guy was just chilling there, like not saying anything, just like, and then all of a sudden his blood explodes and he goes like, it's like, whoa, dude, what happened? You know, like, and then like all the tendrils start like coming out of him. I thought it was hilarious when they're all tied to the guy. They're like, holy shit, get me off of this. I thought that was hilarious. Yeah.
Or like when is and he like the monster comes out of like his chest or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And I just think that it's like it's like this whole thing of like you're trying to save someone and then they like turn into like a monster.
Yeah.
It's like such a terrible thing to happen. I think another thing we talked about briefly was like how the fact that this movie, like, we kind of came in expecting it to be much scarier than it was. And like this idea of the difference between like horror that we have now, which I think is a lot more like jump scare based. Like you watch like essentially like all horror movies, their trailers nowadays are like basically trailer really like builds up. It's not very gory, but I think like the body horror in this movie, although definitely probably not scary for us at the time watching this in theaters, I could definitely see it being like a lot more grotesque. But I just wanted to talk about what you guys think like the fact that this is like a body horror movie does for like naturalism and realism and formalism.
I guess the body horror, I don't know. I haven't thought about that in the sense of realism and formalism. I guess in some ways I might put it toward formalism just because I guess with horror films now, it's more of like you said, the jump scare. So it seems a little more like experimental or something like that. But I'm not sure like what horror movies were doing at the time that this came out. Like if there was a lot of jump scares or like what type of horror movies were usually produced.
Yeah, I definitely thought it was like really interesting. Like I know that a lot of times um horror movies that I would typically say are in like the 10, 11 kind of reaching up to 11 horror categories are usually avant-garde horror movies. Um like when I think of classical like horror movies in Hollywood, I think of things that scare you in the moment but don't necessarily like leave you scarred. Which like I have seen movies where I was left like scarred afterwards and I was like, "Oh my god." Um
Just can't unsee
Movies
it.
that are really. What'd you say? Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say like something like you just can't unsee like the body horror, like something
Yeah.
like really grotesque.
Yeah, like there's this movie called The Platform that was on Netflix and after I watched that, I could not eat. I was like so disgusted,
Oh,
I almost threw up. And I think that
that
like
was so fun.
movies that use like really grotesque body horror are more likely very avant-garde. Um and so I think that that's something that definitely like takes this movie into a little bit of a more formalistic realm in the fact that like their body horror is definitely more approaching that than like I definitely don't think the body horror in this is like naturalism. Like I think we all like that's what makes it kind of more funny and more fake is the fact that like obviously we don't like this is how it works. And also like speaking of like naturalism and like feeling like speech is like normal, they like find these aliens, like they stumble upon like an alien like ancient artifact that's been there for what they say it's like 10,000 years or something, and they're kind of like just chilling about it. Like they're like, oh, this thing can shapeshift into like anything, like it's like morphing, and they're just like nice. And I would be like, I would like piece the scene as soon as this happened. I'd be like, I'm leaving. I want to get out. This is terrifying. Like, I'd be crying. I'd be screaming. And so I definitely think that that's something that's like anti-naturalism, I guess. But not necessarily formalism. I think that's something that's like very Hollywood, is having people kind of react a little bit like non-realistic to to uh, like something really scary.
So on the topic of the body horror, I think it does have a lot of ties to the realism and natural and well, especially formalism, given that it was such a different way of producing a horror film. Um, and I see where they were going with the body horror, making it the horror movie, but I feel like, and which is totally acceptable given that it was kind of an experimental film in a way, because of this body horror. It wasn't your classic like jump scare or like it was kind of like the who's the killer, but like everyone was the killer. I don't know. It was very interesting. But honestly, I wouldn't have rated it as a 10 on the horror scale. I honestly wasn't really that scared like by the film at all. So one thing, Hugh, if you're watching this, I challenge you to send me a film that's like really scary. Like I want it. I want the scariness. And also like but like I totally see like the body horror cuz it was very grotesque. Like the part that comes to me when I think of how grotesque this film actually is um was the part when he was on the operating table and then he ate the doctor's hands and then his head fell off and like crawled along the floor. I was like, what the heck am I watching here? But yeah, that's just my take on the body horror. I thought it was interesting for the time, but it really didn't scare me that.
Lawson, you should watch Cannibal Holocaust. Cannibal Holocaust.
I'm dead. I'm dead.
It's a movie that I cannot come back from.
I should be careful what I wish for. Honestly.
I think he'll find a scary movie for you, a really terrifying, just life-changing, scarring movie.
I still to this day, the one movie that I think I will never ever watch in my life is The Human Centipede. I don't even know if it's scary because I will never allow myself to come into contact with even images of the movie. But I've just typed up in my head scariest thing in the world, and I'm like, I won't even look it up because I don't even want to see what it looks like because I've just made it so scary.
Well, how are we doing on time? Just curious.
I think we're just about at 30 minutes, I think.
Is there anything you guys want to say about the film extra?
Oh, something that I did want to talk about is like the blood in the movie. Like it's so vibrantly red. And I thought that was like interesting because go both ways. I feel like in some ways I could feel like that's almost like naturalistic because the fact that it's so bright red kind of makes it more scary for me somehow. Like the blood in the movie, like when they're dissecting the monster, like the thing, like that super red vibrant blood, it almost made it feel more grotesque, which made it feel more realistic, even though that's not what blood looks like. But the fact that it made the blood seem scarier to me and like kind of like make me more uncomfortable by it made me feel like it was more realistic because I was having like that emotional approach to what it looked like, not necessarily that it mimics reality. the more of it like it mimics what I would feel if I was like actually seeing that. So overall, I think that do we have any other things to say about naturalism? I feel like we didn't really have that many like points as to naturalism, um, and things that we saw during the movie. Or maybe we want to like quickly discuss like our ending thoughts about like how it ended and like
I
everyone's
mean,
dead and no one
yeah.
will ever survive.
I mean, I guess on like naturalism, I thought the setting kind of felt like there's just a naturalistic aspect of it. It felt very real. I mean, I've never been to the Antarctic, obviously, but um, it seemed very real when they would go outside and like there was like ice on their beards or something, and they're very frozen, and they were going to experience like hypothermia if they're outside too long. I guess that part of the movie made it feel more real and like it was more of like a realistic film. I don't know if that's all I could think of.
Yeah, those first opening shots, I was like, this looks really like it. The film kind of had this cinematic scope, which was like a very broad scope of the Arctic, which made me feel like it was like really filmed there. Like
Mhm.
they had these mountains that seemed to be like huge and these like long like plains of just like white snow that like made me definitely feel much more immersed and like it was actually shot in the Arctic, even if there was like a Hollywood approach of like sound in it and like cinematography, feel on like the actual Arctic around them was definitely very nice.
Yeah, it almost felt like in the beginning it was like almost like gonna start like going into a narrative like documentary or something with like the helicopter like kind of flying around and the panning of like the mountains and stuff like that.
I have a quick question. Do you guys think that um oftentimes like science fiction horror is harder to be like naturalistic because of the fact that we sit here and we know obviously there aren't shapeshifters, like something maybe more like possession, which is a little less sci-fi because like possessions have actually been something that is like people believe in possessions. There are actually like seances and like people who come and like read spirits. There's a lot of it in like Christianity and like voodooism is a big thing that's like based on spirits and so I was just wondering if you think like things like this, like these uh horror movies, these body horror movies, these sci-fi movies are harder to be naturalistic when it's kind of obvious to us that this is not like a plausible thing.
Yeah, I would say that I would agree with that standpoint. I would say the overall like alien monster part of it made it really hard to feel like it was a naturalistic film or like the reality in it, and just that sci-fi approach definitely doesn't fit with that naturalism. Um, I was thinking about that as I was watching the movie. I was like, this is definitely not like a catered toward a naturalistic type of film, and I feel like the only real aspect of naturalism they had to go on was the setting of the film and that kind of thing. So I definitely think sci-fi films have a harder time fitting with the naturalism, like continuum of scale, especially if it's like something in like space or something like that. So I definitely agree with that standpoint.
Okay, well, I think that's it if we don't have anything else to share. Um, so overall, I definitely thought that this was like a much harder thing to grasp than some of the other things we've talked about. I think that you have to be like really attentive and uh very specific points, but also think very broad. I think like the main thing I struggled with was like self-reflexivity in this movie. And like watching a movie and trying to think like of these meta things almost is kind of difficult sometimes. And I definitely wish that I was able to watch the film maybe like twice to like kind of get like a better understanding of like if I thought it like on just like the general picture of the movie while looking at these things, because this is the first time we've like really looked at a movie with these kind of lenses. So I definitely think it's something that you need to like own and like watch more movies, hone your skills on like these three lenses.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think overall we pretty much concluded that this film was classical Hollywood. That was like the majority of the film, but there were shades of formalism, and I guess towards the end there were a couple things that were more naturalistic, but overall definitely classical Hollywood and formalistic.
Yeah, I definitely think maybe the human behavior towards the end is naturalism. The fact of like trust was very like the way that you can't trust anyone is like very naturalistic, I think, and that's like a human trait that we have. And so I think that that would definitely like by the end it kind of goes more into naturalism, maybe not visually, but kind of like mentally.
Yeah, especially at the very end when who was it? Childs comes back and McReady knows, like he thinks that everyone else is dead, but then Childs come back and he has no idea whether he's an alien or not. And so, but like everything's exploded and there's nothing that either of them can do. So they just kind of like accept the fact that they distrust each other, like knowing that if they're both human, then they're both gonna die, or if one of them's an alien, then they have ultimately lost.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit like existentialist at the end, where it's kind of like you can't even trust yourself, you can't trust anyone around you, so there's like nothing to do. Just sit back, drink a glass of whiskey, and like wait, wait for the end of the world. Okay, well, I think that wraps up this very spooky episode of Put on Dejour. So thank
In addition.
you for watching. What'd you
Thank
say?
you.
Thank you.